This is my first year to let a mom actually pick out the video, so worked good. It was good, Courtney. I appreciate it. Oh, man. It really was. A lot of truth in that. I think that as we recognize and just become aware that motherhood is really it is an amazing calling, and I don't want to say vocation because it's a life, that the investment that moms make in kids should tell us something. And one of the things I want it to tell us today is I want it to tell us how important kids are. And there's something that God puts in mothers that heralds that. There's a built-in into the very fabric of a mother's heart, fathers too, of course, a value that they place on their children, and just an inherent regard for the worth and the impact and the value that kids bring into our lives. So here's what I want us to do. I want us to start today looking at children. I don't necessarily mean physically. We're not going to all turn around and look at kids, but we could if we wanted to. But what I want us to do is to really rethink our thoughts about children, and not just children being present in the world, but children, especially what it means to have children in our lives as we learn to do life with God and community. Now, what that means is that the proposal is going to be on the table that is going to drive this whole series, is that maybe we need to rethink who needs who. Absolutely. We're going to put it on. Kids need adults. Of course, we get that. We understand our role, I hope, and the value that adults bring to children's lives. But I don't know that we've ever looked at it from the inside out. What is the value that kids, why do we need children? So let's ask that question today. What role do children have in our journey as a church and as families, individuals? What role do they have in helping us do life with God and community? What's their place? What's the significance? What's the impact? And I want us to look at Jesus' own words here. And I think if we could back up and just kind of look at it with fresh eyes, like we've never read or heard anything like this before, we would see ourselves literally amazed at the value that Jesus just places on kiddos. So I want you to look at Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 4 today. Would you stand today? We're just going to recognize that this is God's Word, not the newspaper, not something on social media. It's not the newscast. This is not a thought that some guy had. This is God's Word to us. It's timeless, it's true, and it's living and active, and it speaks to our world today. And Jesus, in chapter 18, is going to speak about children. Matthew records this. He says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus, and they said, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" It's their question. The disciples come to Jesus and they ask him this question: "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now notice Jesus' response. "And he," Jesus, "called a child to himself, and he set him before them. And he said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" Pray with me. Father, there is so much in those 4 verses. So much to take in, to absorb. So much that speaks to our culture and our tendencies to do things differently than the Word, than your Word prescribes to us, especially in our approach and in our attitude toward children. Father, I want to do justice to what Jesus spoke that day, and so I lean now very intentionally on your wisdom and your power, because this is beyond me. And I ask you to speak across the spectrum to this congregation about these truths. And we're going to ask you to do that in a way that none of us walks away with ambiguity. You would speak clearly today. Give us ears to hear and a heart to know. Today we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So the disciples come, and they ask Jesus this question. It's kind of surprising, I think, that they would say, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus, who's going to be the best? Who's going to be the biggest? Who's going to be the most noteworthy person in the kingdom of heaven? Which one of us is kind of the implication is going to be there? And so there's a question behind the question that Jesus answers. You notice at first his response really doesn't answer their first initial question. And so the issue here, the thing that's coming up is this attitude behind the question that prompts the question. And it seems to indicate that there's this jockeying for position among the disciples. Who's going to be the favorite? Who's going to be the best? Who's going to be the greatest? And there's this unhealthy desire for rank among them or being noteworthy. It's pride at the core. And the kind of pride that pits itself against God. And so Jesus does this amazing thing, and as he answers that question, and he answers actually a question that they didn't ask, which was, how do you get into the kingdom of heaven? Jesus answers that question first. So their question, however, is, what can I do? The disciples' question at the core is, what can I do? What can I do to ensure that I'm among the greatest or the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so we are not immune, as we walk through this, we are not immune from this destructive attitude. And I don't think unfortunately, I don't think it's uncommon. I think we are pretty adept at hiding it or masking it in many ways. So we may not be asking, how can we be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That may not be a question you said in your G2 group this morning. Hey, to your G2 group leader, how can I be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Probably didn't get asked, but it's the same attitude that insists on us getting our own way. It's the same attitude that tries to make sure others think more highly of us, or simply thinking of ourselves most often and ahead of others. It's a rampant attitude and the problem in the world today. Now look at verse 2 and 3. So Jesus' response is no less than shocking if we just can get there and understand. So he called a little child. In the day, the child had no rank. In Jesus' day, children were to be seen and not heard, right? They were not held up as the pinnacle or example for anything. So Jesus' response is certainly culturally abrasive. And he says that he calls this little child, he had him stand among them, and he said, I tell you the truth. Now listen here, Jesus said, listen here. Unless you, who are asking me who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, unless you, he said, become like little children, like this one, unless you're converted, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Do you see the question that he answered? That they didn't ask? How do I get into the kingdom of heaven? They were saying, hey, we're in, but who's going to be the greatest? And Jesus said, you need to back up. Until we become like children, unless you're converted and changed and transformed, become like children, you're not getting into the kingdom of heaven. In other words, this attitude tells us something dangerous about our own propensity to think of ourselves in a way that is tremendously unhealthy and dangerous. So as the disciples' mind, greatness in the kingdom is not unlike ours most of the time. Greatness in the kingdom was equivalent to power and position, an authority or recognition. Greatness, as they were thinking, was a position of prestige. And there was a definite element of being kind of an elite in their understanding of who would be the greatest. Now, Jesus just couldn't have been, I don't think, more opposite of what they were thinking in terms of the response. So he calls that child, the child comes and stands among them, and with their attention on the child, Jesus speaks deeply and significantly to how far off they are in their questioning and what that question reveals. So in essence, Jesus tells them, right now you don't need to be concerned. This is not a question about who's the greatest. We need to talk about who can live in and among the kingdom. So as we've talked about this culturally, what we're saying is that we're not necessarily, I don't want us to think about who's in and who's out, who's saved and who's lost, but how do you live in the atmosphere of the kingdom of heaven here on this earth and then forevermore? How do you dwell with God in this life and remain in fellowship with Him? How do you live there? And how does that look? What does that look like? Instead of thinking about how can I be the greatest, how can I be the best, and Jesus calls the child and He points to Him. So they needed to turn their thinking entirely around, right? They were thinking about something that was just not in their pay grade, just not in, it wasn't even relevant to what really needed to be considered. And they needed to learn what it meant to actually enter and to live in, not just cross a bridge, but to dwell in the kingdom of heaven at all. And he told them they needed to change, drastically needed to change. And he used the word for change. It means to turn around or reverse course entirely. So they're on entirely. He says you have to reverse course and primarily in your thinking entirely. You can't just, this is not tweaking, you're not just a little off. You have to do a 180 here in your thought processes, in your approach to the kingdom. And he said that they were headed in entirely the wrong direction there. So they needed to turn that around. They're thinking around. Instead of worrying or being considered or frustrated with or jockeying for this position about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, they should instead do the thing that was furthest from their mind. This was furthest from their mind. Instead, you become like this little child. Well, he's not going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. They never thought, no one ever pointed to a child in his day and said they're the greatest of anything. And if they didn't, he said if they didn't become like the little children, such as the one that was among them, they would never even enter the kingdom. They wouldn't live in the kingdom of heaven. No need to worry about who's the biggest and the best if you aren't in it, right? No need to jockey for position if you don't have a place. The small child was their example, and Jesus pointed at that child and said, become like this. The question begs to be answered is, what is he like? What is he pointing to about the child? And we'll get there. Okay? So living life in the kingdom of heaven is really about that. It's the thoughts of who's greatest or most important in the way of the disciples are thinking contrary to what it even means to exist. You don't exist in the kingdom of heaven like this. You can't breathe in the air of the kingdom of heaven if you're thinking, I want to be the greatest. That's just not how it works. That's not the mode of operation there. So in verse 4, he concludes this, and you look at what he says. He says, therefore, since I've said that, whoever humbles himself, now he's pointing to what he's pointing at in this child, humbles himself like this child, they're the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It's not talking to their childish ways or being silly or having a propensity to be naive or anything like that. He's pointing to this attitude and this posture, this demeanor of humility, which was the exact opposite of what they were jockeying to lay hold of. So they were jockeying to lay hold of the greatest in terms of power, prestige. Look at me. And Jesus said, that's not great. This is great. This child who doesn't have thoughts of greatness of himself or putting themselves over others or having everybody say, look how great they are. But this child had a posture and a demeanor and an attitude and a position in the culture and in that group of true, profound, and sincere. There. I was trying to talk loud enough. All right. So, just backing up, because battery threw me off here. Let me get another running start at where I was. So Jesus points to this child, and he lifts up the child's obvious posture of humility and said, this is greatness, not what you were thinking. Not what you were thinking at all. And we in the church are simply trying to, and I don't even know. Honestly, usually I have a better barometer of this, but I don't even know generally where this is going to land with us. I just know we need to hear it. I know I need to hear it. I know I need to take this in. That children are certainly in need of our leadership and our care and our teaching. But the reverse is also true. If Jesus is going to take a child and put him before the disciples and say, become like this child, we have to rethink how we think about children. That is, we need them too. Not just because they lighten the mood, not just because they make us smile, not just because they're cute and cuddly when they're babies. We're not talking about that, and we'll get to what the value is there greatly. So there was not a thought, and this child in the story, there's just, you can get the picture of how uncomfortable that child would be. You can get it by just, if I called a 5-year-old up here today that wasn't, familiar with this or anything, if I just called them up and put them in front of you, you would see what Jesus is talking about. They wouldn't be, most 5-year-olds, there are some exceptions obviously, but most 5-year-olds wouldn't be going, woo, I got the limelight, look at me, look at all these adults staring at me, this is great, look, I've got everybody's attention. You would see, again, in most children, you'd see a posture and an attitude and a response of humility like, I don't really deserve or want to be up here. I don't want all of this attention. I don't want everybody looking at me. But the attitude that Jesus is rebuking was is the disciples were asking this, how can I get everybody to notice me? And Jesus said, that's not greatness. Greatness is this. So my point here is simple, I think it's clear, is that we have to learn that. We have to take from our children, and I'm not just saying, let's all try to be more humble. What I'm saying is, it's how do we as a church explore this in a way that allows us to really look at children and say, we need to learn from them. We need them. We need their example. We need to reorient some things about how we do stuff so that we can place the value that is appropriate on children's lives and their presence among us. So Jesus says this, in essence, he says, do you see this child? Do you see his clearly apparent posture of humility? This is what greatness looks like. And the word Jesus used for humble, in the New American Standard anyway, it uses the word humble, is this modest opinion of oneself. And that's probably a little light. It's really an abased self, not a terrible self-image, but just a lack of consideration of self. And that kind of humility is a condition of the heart. It doesn't seek to lift itself up and say, look at me. It seeks to put itself lower so that it can notice and see others. And genuine humility is the measure. Church, hear this. When we talk about greatness, we talk about just use the word significance. What matters in the kingdom is not how many people you can impress with your biblical knowledge. It's not even how many good things you can do. It's not how smart you are, how spiritual you are, how many books you've read, or how consistent attendance. That's not greatness. Greatness is the presumption that others are more important than self. And that is an inherent trait in most children's lives. It's something that we can learn from them. It's this essential part of who they are. So Jesus turned the cultural norms of the day on their head regarding the position and value of children, for sure. And the norm was to keep them out of the way, right? Like when the children are clamoring for Jesus' attention one day and the disciples are saying, be quiet and leave him alone. And Jesus said, no, permit the little children to come to me. And he reversed it, and they thought they were doing him a good deed. And Jesus said, no, you're not. So the norm was a child's place was to be quiet and still and not to disrupt. And Jesus, on more than one occasion, obliterates that norm and brings the child front and center, as he is in the story today, and says, this is what the kingdom looks like, and this is how we live here. And so I want us to notice this. I want to notice what Jesus is at the very core of his message. It's not just a message about humility. I believe this. I don't think that it's just an incidental, like, hey, I can use a child to teach this. I think that Jesus is putting a value into the child, into children, that we don't put. And this is greatness in the kingdom of heaven like we've never seen it. So I want us to see this, that Jesus is challenging to look, I think today as much as then, for us to look at children differently. And again, I think all children, of course, but specifically their role in the church family. And how do we approach that? How do we think of that? See, very often, this is very true here. Our attitude toward children in regard to important spiritual activities is the same as it was that day. Shh, quiet. Don't disrupt what's important that the adults are doing. I'm painting in broad strokes, but that's a pretty prevailing attitude that we take towards kiddos. And so we want to make them sit and still and be quiet, and it's very counter to their normal posture. And I'm not saying we need to just say, hey, you can climb up the walls, but their attitude is still today, adults are doing what's important, children should quietly not disrupt. And that false assumption that frequently drives our attitude and our approach to children is that they have nothing or very little to offer adults when it comes to real worship or kingdom living. I believe that's false. And I think that Jesus is teaching us that's false. So I'm not going to do a one and done here. We're going to explore this because I think this is challenging for us. We may nod our heads easily in sentimental agreement and affection for kids, and it's Mother's Day, and I get all that. But I think we have work to do here today and in the days to come about rearranging our thought processes. Jesus said the word that we have to embrace, which is be converted, to be transformed in our thinking so that our approach to children, it lines up more with what Jesus has said. So just go back and say, Jesus used a child as the model for kingdom life, how to live in it, how to enter it. He said, this is it. And when is the last time you heard that message from me or from anybody else who said, hey, if you want to do life in the kingdom, And I would tell you all kinds of practice spiritual disciplines and, live in community, all of that. And all of that is true. We're not negating that. But what we've left out is a vastly important and significant resource, blessing, and powerful impact, which is what? Our children. And that's what Jesus is doing here today, and what he did that day, and I believe what he's still doing today. And so while children, absolutely, I'm not saying they don't need our guidance and we follow the children. I'm not saying that. They need our instruction of adults. They need us to be present with them, and it's essential to our own spiritual formation. I get their formation, but their presence with us is also essential to us, to our formation and our ability to experience life in the kingdom of heaven. Children's ministries like ours, for the past 12 years since I've been here, have always universally, week in and week out, struggled to get what we would call volunteers to serve our children. So you can use all kinds of tactics here, right? You can say, and motivations, if you will. You say, well, they need us. Just think, the parents need a break, and they need you back there so they can come out here. Or those children need you to teach them Bible lessons. They need you to love them. And all true. I don't think any of those are invalid at all. But it's all, that's our message, is they need us. They need us. And it's a sacrifice for you, but you got to see the greater good, and you got to go give it up, and you need to go back there and serve, or over there, or wherever. So our attitude is really the same. It's strikingly the same. And so we go, well, I guess we got to have somebody serve in the nursery, or I guess somebody's got to serve an extended session. I guess I'll do it. And so, listen, I'm not going on any other information other than this. It is tremendously hard for us to get adults to serve our kids. And that, I am presuming, is indicative. It tells us that our attitude is, it takes from me, but it doesn't give back to me. And I'm not willing to do that because I don't want to sacrifice. I mean, we'll say things that are ludicrous, like, that's not my spiritual gift. I mean, when did you ever see that listed as a spiritual gift? When did we ever say, I'm not good at being with kids? You would be the first person that needs to go be with kids. Now, maybe under the supervision of somebody who is good with kids. But you probably need to sit and let children climb on your lap and be there present with them. Now, if we think about the message that Jesus is communicating in this passage that we looked at today, I think we can see easy this transfer of conclusions that we have a desperate need to be with and learn from children. That when we ask you to, and this, listen, no one's coming to me and saying, hey, we need to get more people in the nursery. They have many times in the past. This has not precipitated this message. This was really reading and thoughtful prayer conversations with other leaders that we have to adopt a different attitude here. And I hope, listen, unashamedly, I hope that one of the outcomes is that we don't ever even have to ask for volunteers to serve. I hope that's an outcome. I hope that this is a result, because we learn, hopefully, that we have a great need to be present with children and to learn to see life through their eyes, to learn to see the kingdom through their eyes, to learn to approach Jesus in their approach. And I don't know how else you interpret Jesus' statement that's so strong here today. Unless you convert, become like this child, you'll never even enter the kingdom of heaven. And if you want to see what great looks like, look at this child in the kingdom of heaven. They need us. I say it again, but it is every bit as true that we need them. So how would that change your thought process today? Maybe even starting as a parent. Like, man, God has given me these children, not for me just to teach, but that they could teach me. That I could slow down. One of the things I'm really trying to practice is, and I'm certainly not there yet, but one of the things about kids Griffin's age and others is that they're present in the moment. And one of my greatest faults as an adult is to not be present in the moment. To be 5 steps ahead, meaning usually days or tasks. But my son is just never there. He's usually right where we are. And if I can slow down and just, and I'm trying to do this more and more, if I can just literally have to get down to where he is. I did this yesterday, just kind of look at the world from his level, I mean physically, to remind me that I need to see the world spiritually from that perspective. It's helping me. It's kind of reorienting. And no doubt the fact that this message is going to become verbalized motivated me, but it's powerful. I think that when we if I would allow myself to see the world, to see the kingdom of heaven, not through an adult lens, but through the eyes of a child, we'll be changed. If we could just say, I wonder what I can learn from being with children about Jesus and about His kingdom. Knowing that Jesus said we can. Knowing that Jesus, and this is, like I said, if this was the only instance that Jesus did something like this, maybe we really still couldn't because it's so strong, but there are other instances that validate that this is His constant message. And I think that message is unmistakable. Learning to do life with God in community requires adults. It requires that it's not just an option or an added bonus. It requires that we attend to and become present with children. Not just to take care of them, make sure they're safe. Not just to teach them the Bible stories, all good. But to with a posture of saying, I wonder in my adulthood what has gotten marred and what's gotten twisted by my adult thinking and approach. How am I saying, how can I be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? How can I be reoriented to what greatness really looks like if I bent down and sat on the floor with a child? I'm talking about a child that could just crawl all over you and just maybe pull your hair. Maybe not even be able to verbalize anything, but I'm hungry with a cry. But to be there and be present and to say, I need this. I need this as much as they need me. That's a pretty high value that Jesus assigns them. Don't you think? Have you ever even considered it? That the need's a two-way street? Have you ever even thought about that? Instead of, if I had Sarah said, if I had her come up here and said, Sarah, I need you to make an appeal. Let's get some people back there. And she says, we need you. We need those. We got kids, and we're going to have more kids, and our adults are tired. And the whole message kind of is communicated, I know we need kids, and I love kids, but I just want to do my thing. And I don't want that to take from me, and I don't want to give something that doesn't get, we don't say it that way, but that's really what we're saying. Well, what if we could rethink this? What if as a church, anytime we said you have an opportunity to be with kids, you knew it was going to pour into you? Now listen, that's not inevitable. If you go back there with the who's greatest in the kingdom mindset, and your answer is already by default you, then you're not going to learn anything. And they may just drive you up one wall and down the other and throw up on you. And that's your value, right? That's what you think when we say go serve in the nursery at extended session. But what if the next time that appeal was made, or we didn't even make an appeal, you just rethought your approach here and said, and Jesus said this, and it doesn't have to be anything more than this. Jesus said, I have a lot to learn from children about living life in the kingdom. And it's difficult to learn from children if I'm not present with them. And by present, I don't mean just physically. I mean being present in their world. I'm just going to be immediate. I feel like a massive hypocrite saying this, okay? Because it is hard for me. I tell you all the time, if something works for me and I've gotten there and I'm down the road, I'll say, hey, this is working, this is good. I'm telling you on the front end of this learning curve, I'm right there. This is not easy for me to slow down and get down. For me, it's going to require sitting on the floor. I'm telling you, being at eye level to make me remember that not only am I seeing physically at their level, but spiritually. And that there's value coming to me through, I'm learning from them. And Jesus' message is clear, guys. The last thing I want this to be is guilt-inducing. This is the last thing. My hope is, as we walk through this series together, my hope is that eyes are opened and we are aghast with excitement in a few weeks of saying, I have missed this. And I have an opportunity to recapture what I've been letting pass by me the whole time. Some of you I would commend already is that you clearly already get this. And I know I'm not preaching to everybody here this morning. That some of you are like, it's time for you. I'm glad you finally realized this. I get that I'm a late adopter, if you would say. But I do believe this. And it's an emerging conviction in my life. And I want us to become fundamentally different as a culture in our church and how we value and celebrate children. We'll unpack some of those possibilities in the days to come. Today, all I want you to do is to ask yourself this question as you walk out of here today. What can I learn from children about living life with God in community? They are not afterthoughts, and they're not mere responsibilities. They are part of the culture and the fabric of life in God's kingdom, here and now and forever. So let's celebrate that. And so with that, I say this again. Moms, thank you for your investment. And Dad, your day's coming. Our day's coming in June. We'll say the same thing because it's a two-way street there too. But I do thank our mothers today with sincerity and certainly with great, great gratitude for my own mother who's in heaven, but also for those who are continuing to mother. And I will tell you this is one of the coolest things about Covenant. There are lots of mothers who aren't biological mothers to the people that they're mothering. You know what I'm saying? Saw it yesterday. I've seen it many times where there's just a fostering of affection from you adopt a mom or a mom adopts others just in terms of relationship, and it's beautiful. So let's keep that up, and let's be mindful today that God's doing a new work in terms of our attitude and our approach to kids. I really think that. As we move forward, I want to welcome your feedback, your input, and your thoughts and your questions. I certainly make myself available if you want to give a call or send an email. If you want to have a visit, I'll be glad to sit with you and talk and explore what this looks like, how this is unfolding, and maybe your thoughts and your experiences. I do not position myself before you today as an expert on this. Anybody that knows me very well would know that, so it's not really a hard admission for me to make. I love kids, but I am just now learning the great, great value that they bring to the kingdom. And I'm really, truly excited about it. So would you conclude today? Would you pray with me about this? And let's just ask God to do something that we never even saw coming and that would be powerful and effective in us. Lord Jesus, we're just going to envision that moment right now where you called that young child into the middle of learned, spiritually elite adults as they were thinking of themselves. And we're going to see that child struggling to even make eye contact. Clearly uncomfortable with the attention that they're receiving. So willing to step into the shadows of all that's going on and to not be noticed. And God, we need some of that in us to step back and let others step forward, to have no assumption of our own greatness, no thought of it. God, would you teach us this through our children? And God, would you remind us to bend low, to not just pat them on the head conveniently as they go by, literally or even metaphorically, but that we would stop and say, there's a kingdom bearer. There's greatness walking by me, according to Jesus. And I want to seize these opportunities, God. Lord, we love you. I want to thank you for surprising us, for taking us down unexpected twists and turns in the road. Our journey with you is always like that. And I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful for our children today. I ask you to bless them and keep them. Let your radiance glow, just be a glow through them. And when we make eye contact with our children, that we would see that we would see it. You change us, God. We'll submit to your authority, your great plan. We know it's perfect, and we'll trust it today in Jesus' great name. Amen.